When an avoidant goes silent, you have exactly 7 seconds to either save your relationship or destroy it completely. In those crucial moments, your instinctive response will determine whether they see you as someone worth respecting or just another person who doesn't understand their psychological patterns. Most people fail this test spectacularly, using those 7 seconds to chase, explain, apologize, or demand responses, all of which confirm the avoidant's deepest fears about relationships being overwhelming and invasive. The silent treatment from an avoidant isn't punishment, manipulation, or a power play. It's their nervous system's emergency shutdown protocol when they feel emotionally flooded, misunderstood, or overwhelmed by intimacy. Their silence is actually communication, but it's speaking a language most people never learn to understand. When you respond to their silence with the wrong words or energy, you're essentially screaming at someone who's already covering their ears, guaranteeing they'll withdraw even further. But there's one specific response that cuts through their defenses like a key designed for their exact psychological lock. These words feel so safe to their nervous system that they actually create curiosity instead of further withdrawal. This response is counterintuitive, requires incredible self-control, and goes against every instinct you have when someone you care about suddenly becomes emotionally unavailable. The 7-second test isn't about manipulation or strategy. It's about demonstrating emotional intelligence that speaks directly to their deepest needs for safety, respect, and autonomy. When you pass this test, you don't just get them to break their silence, you fundamentally change how they see you and your relationship. You become the rare person who understands their language, respects their process, and doesn't try to force them out of their protective shell before they're ready to emerge. The words you choose in those 7 seconds will either trigger their pursuit response or their deeper withdrawal. Get it wrong, and you'll be met with longer silences, more emotional distance, and the growing sense that they're slowly checking out of the relationship entirely. Get it right, and you'll witness something remarkable. An avoidant who actually feels safe enough to reconnect because you've proven you're not like everyone else who tried to force them out of their emotional hiding place. What not to say, the common mistakes that make it worse. The most destructive response to an avoidant silence is the desperate pursuit that most people default to when someone they care about suddenly becomes emotionally unavailable. What's wrong? Why won't you talk to me? Did I do something? These questions feel natural and caring to you, but to their overwhelmed nervous system, they sound like emotional demands that require energy they don't have and vulnerability they can't access in their current state. Chasing them with explanations is equally damaging because it confirms their fear that relationships require constant emotional labor and management of other people's reactions. When you launch into lengthy justifications for your behavior, detailed analysis of what happened, or elaborate attempts to fix whatever you think went wrong, you're essentially proving that being close to you means having to process complex emotional situations even when they're already at capacity. The apology spiral is particularly toxic because it teaches them that your emotional state depends on their responsiveness, making them feel responsible for managing your anxiety about their silence. I'm sorry if I upset you. I didn't mean to make you shut down. Please don't be mad at me. These statements put pressure on them to reassure you when they're the ones who need space to regulate their own emotional system. Demanding immediate resolution or explanation violates their fundamental need for processing time and emotional autonomy. We need to talk about this right now. I can't handle the silent treatment. You're being unfair by not communicating. These responses make their natural coping mechanism feel wrong or selfish, adding shame to their already overwhelmed state and making them less likely to open up when they're ready. The guilt trip approach backfires spectacularly because it confirms their belief that relationships are about managing other people's emotions rather than authentic connection. This is really hurting me. I feel like you don't care about my feelings. Your silence is making me anxious. These statements make their need for space about your emotional needs, creating exactly the kind of overwhelming responsibility they're trying to escape. Analyzing their behavior out loud is incredibly invasive and triggers their fear of being studied, diagnosed, or fixed by someone who doesn't understand their internal experience. You always do this when we get close. This is your avoidant attachment showing. You're just scared of intimacy. These observations, even if accurate, feel like psychological violation when they're already feeling exposed and overwhelmed. Threatening consequences or ultimatums during their silent periods is the fastest way to turn temporary withdrawal into permanent exit. If you don't talk to me, I'm leaving. I can't be in a relationship with someone who shuts down. This is your last chance to explain yourself. These statements trigger their abandonment fears, while simultaneously making leaving feel like the safer option than staying and dealing with emotional pressure. The comparison trap is equally destructive, pointing out how other people handle conflict, how your ex used to communicate, or how normal couples work through problems. This makes them feel defective for having different emotional needs and processing styles, adding shame to an already difficult internal experience and making them less likely to trust you with their vulnerability in the future. Emotional flooding them with your own feelings during their shutdown period overwhelms their already taxed system and confirms their fear that relationships require more emotional capacity than they possess. Crying, expressing your devastation about their silence, or sharing how triggered you feel by their withdrawal makes their coping mechanism about your emotional crisis rather than their need for regulation. The fix-it mentality, while well-intentioned, treats their silence like a problem to be solved rather than a communication style to be respected. Offering solutions, suggesting communication strategies, or trying to teach them better ways to express their feelings makes them feel judged for their natural process and adds pressure to perform emotional availability they can't genuinely access. Social pressure tactics, mentioning what friends think, bringing up relationship standards, or referencing how unhealthy their silence appears to others, make them feel ganged up on and misunderstood by people who don't know their internal experience. This isolation deepens their withdrawal and makes them less likely to trust that you're on their side rather than trying to change them into someone more emotionally convenient. The most damaging mistake is making their silence about you, your adequacy as a partner, your worth in the relationship, or your ability to handle their emotional patterns. When you interpret their withdrawal as rejection of you personally rather than their way of managing overwhelming feelings, you create additional emotional labor for them to manage your self-esteem while they're already struggling to manage their own emotional regulation. The 7-second test, the exact words that work. When an avoidant goes silent, there's one response that bypasses their defenses and speaks directly to their nervous system's need for safety and autonomy. After they shut down, you wait a moment, then say with calm, genuine energy, "I can see you need some space right now. I'm here when you're ready." Then you do the hardest thing imaginable. You actually give them that space without hovering, checking in, or trying to fix the situation. These specific words work because they accomplish multiple psychological objectives simultaneously. First, they demonstrate that you can read their emotional state without them having to explain it, which feels like understanding rather than pressure. Second, they show respect for their coping mechanism instead of pathologizing or fighting against it. Third, they offer availability without demand, creating safety rather than obligation. Most importantly, they prove you're not going to chase, force, or punish them for needing to regulate their emotional system. The phrase, "I can see you need some space," validates their internal experience without requiring them to justify or explain their withdrawal. Most people miss this entirely, either pretending the silence isn't happening or demanding explanations for it. By acknowledging their need directly, you're demonstrating emotional intelligence that feels rare and valuable to someone whose coping mechanisms are usually misunderstood or attacked. Right now is crucial because it implies temporariness rather than permanence, addressing their fear that you might interpret their silence as rejection or ending. Avoidants often worry that their need for space will be seen as lack of caring. So acknowledging that this is a current need rather than a permanent state helps them feel less guilty about their natural process. "I'm here when you're ready" provides reassurance without pressure, offering availability on their terms rather than yours. This is the opposite of what most people do, which is make their availability conditional on the avoidant's immediate responsiveness. You're essentially saying their timeline for reconnection is safe with you, which is exactly what their nervous system needs to hear to begin relaxing. The tone and energy behind these words matter as much as the words themselves. Your voice should be calm, warm, and genuinely caring without being emotional or urgent. Any desperation, frustration, or hidden agenda in your delivery will undermine the message and trigger their defenses. They need to sense that you mean what you're saying and aren't just performing patience while secretly expecting immediate results. Your body language during this 7-second interaction should mirror your words. Relaxed, non-threatening, and respectful of their space. Don't move closer to them, don't try to make eye contact if they're avoiding it, and don't use gestures that might feel invasive or demanding. Your physical presence should communicate the same respect for their autonomy that your words express. After delivering this response, the real test begins, actually following through on your promise to give them space. This means not texting them an hour later to check in, not hovering around hoping they'll change their mind, not bringing up the silence when they do reconnect. Your actions must match your words, or they'll learn that your respect for their process was performative rather than genuine. The 7-second time frame is critical because it's long enough to choose your response thoughtfully, but short enough to demonstrate that you're not panicking or scrambling for the perfect thing to say. If you take too long to respond, they might interpret your delay as you being upset or formulating a strategy. If you respond too quickly, it might seem reactive rather than considered. This response works because it treats their silence as communication rather than lack of communication. You're essentially saying, I received your message that you need space, and I respect that message. This is profoundly different from the typical response of treating their silence as a problem to be solved or a barrier to be overcome. The power of this approach lies in how it makes them feel seen and understood rather than managed or fixed. Most people respond to avoidant silence by trying to draw them out, which feels invasive and overwhelming. By demonstrating that you can appreciate their need for space, you're showing a level of emotional sophistication that makes you feel safe rather than threatening. Your willingness to respect their process without taking it personally proves that you understand the difference between their coping mechanisms and their feelings about you. This distinction is crucial for avoidants, who often feel guilty about their need for space because they worry it hurts people they care about. When you show that their space-taking doesn't trigger your abandonment fears or need for reassurance, you become a safe person to have needs around. The most powerful aspect of this response is how it demonstrates your own emotional regulation and security. By not chasing, explaining, or demanding immediate reconnection, you're showing that your emotional stability doesn't depend on their constant availability. This independence is incredibly attractive to avoidants because it means being close to you won't feel suffocating or overwhelming. Their internal response? What happens when you get it right? When you deliver the perfect response to their silence, something remarkable happens in the avoidance nervous system. Instead of the expected pursuit and pressure, they encounter understanding and space, which immediately begins to calm their activated fight or flight response. Their brain, primed for emotional invasion and demands for explanation, instead receives validation and respect, creating a cognitive dissonance that forces them to reassess their assumptions about what this interaction was going to cost them emotionally. The first internal shift they experience is relief. Not the temporary relief of successful escape, but the deeper relief of being understood without having to explain themselves. Most people in their lives have trained them to expect that their need for space will be met with hurt feelings, demands for justification, or attempts to force premature reconnection. When you demonstrate that you can read their emotional state and respect their coping mechanism, their nervous system registers this as unprecedented safety. Your unexpected response triggers what psychologists call pattern interruption in their brain. They were prepared for the familiar dance of withdrawal followed by pursuit, shutdown followed by demands for opening up. When this expected pattern doesn't unfold, their defensive systems have to recalibrate, creating a moment of curiosity about your motives and emotional intelligence that replaces their usual anxiety about being misunderstood or pressured. They begin to test the authenticity of your response by monitoring whether your behavior matches your words. Are you really giving them space, or are you hovering nearby waiting for them to emerge? Are you sending subtle signals of hurt or frustration, or do you genuinely seem okay with their process? This testing phase is crucial because they've learned not to trust initial respectful responses that later turn into guilt trips about their emotional needs. The cognitive processing that follows your response often includes surprise at their own reaction. They expected to feel guilty about needing space, but instead they feel respected. They anticipated having to defend their silence, but instead they feel understood. This unexpected emotional outcome forces them to reconsider their assumptions about how their coping mechanisms affect others and whether their need for space is actually as problematic as they've been told. Your respect for their autonomy triggers a psychological phenomenon called reactance reduction. When people feel their freedom is respected rather than threatened, they're more likely to choose connection voluntarily. By not trying to force them out of their shell, you're actually making it safer for them to choose to emerge when they're ready, because they know their decision to reconnect won't be interpreted as permission for future emotional demands. They often experience a shift in how they perceive you within their internal hierarchy of safety. People who chase them during silence get categorized as emotionally needy and potentially overwhelming. People who respect their process get categorized as emotionally intelligent and potentially safe for deeper connection. This recategorization affects not just how they respond to you in the moment, but how much vulnerability they're willing to risk with you in the future. The space you provide allows their nervous system to complete its natural regulation cycle without interference. When they're not managing someone else's reaction to their silence, they can focus on processing whatever triggered their shutdown in the first place. This uninterrupted processing often leads to greater clarity about their own feelings and more authentic communication when they do choose to reconnect. Your response also triggers what attachment theorists call earned security, moments when their nervous system learns that their coping mechanisms can be met with understanding rather than conflict. These experiences gradually reshape their internal working model of relationships from intimacy equals invasion to intimacy can include respect for individual needs. They begin to feel curious about your emotional makeup and relationship history. How did you learn to respond this way? Why aren't you panicking about their silence like most people do? This curiosity is significant because it represents engagement rather than defensive withdrawal. They're interested in understanding you rather than just protecting themselves from you. The absence of pressure creates space for their authentic feelings about you to emerge without contamination from guilt, obligation, or defensive reactivity. When they're not managing your emotional reaction to their coping mechanisms, they can access clearer information about their actual desire for connection with you specifically. Many avoidants report feeling a sense of gratitude mixed with disbelief when someone responds to their silence with genuine respect. This gratitude isn't just about the immediate situation. It's about finally feeling understood in their fundamental need for emotional processing time. This feeling of being seen and accepted for their actual emotional needs rather than who someone wants them to be creates powerful positive associations with your presence. Your response often triggers memories of past relationships where their silence was met with drama, pursuit, or punishment, creating a favorable comparison that makes you stand out as unusually emotionally mature. This contrast effect makes them more likely to prioritize your relationship because they recognize how rare it is to find someone who can respect their process without taking it personally. The most significant internal shift is that they begin to trust that closeness with you won't require them to abandon their coping mechanisms or perform emotional availability they don't genuinely feel. This trust is the foundation for any deeper connection with an avoidant. They need to know that loving you won't require them to sacrifice their psychological safety or pretend to be someone they're not. When to use it versus when to walk away. Understanding when to apply the 7-second test versus when to protect yourself by walking away requires reading the subtle but crucial differences between an avoidant who's temporarily overwhelmed and one who's permanently checking out of the relationship. Not every silence deserves your patience and respect. Some silences are communication that they're done. And responding with space-giving only enables someone who's already mentally and emotionally gone. The key distinction lies in the context surrounding their silence. Temporary shutdown usually follows specific triggers, difficult conversations about the future, moments of increased intimacy, conflict that touched on their vulnerabilities, or external stressors that have overwhelmed their emotional capacity. This type of silence feels reactive rather than calculated, like their nervous system hit an emergency brake rather than making a deliberate choice. to disengage from you permanently. Permanent withdrawal, by contrast, often comes without clear triggers or follows a pattern of increasing emotional distance over time. They're not shutting down because they're overwhelmed. They're shutting down because they've already decided the relationship isn't worth the effort required to work through difficulties. This silence feels different, colder, more definitive, and accompanied by other signs of checking out, like avoiding future plans, reducing physical affection, or seeming relieved when you're not around. Pay attention to their body language and energy during the silence. Temporary shutdown often includes signs of internal struggle. They might seem tense, conflicted, or like they're fighting with themselves about their need for space. You can sense that part of them wants to connect but can't access that capacity right now. Permanent withdrawal typically looks more resolved and peaceful. They seem comfortable with the distance and show no signs of internal conflict about their emotional unavailability. The duration and pattern of their silences also provide crucial information. Temporary shutdown usually resolves within a few hours to a few days, and they typically return with some form of acknowledgement or attempt to reconnect. If someone regularly disappears for weeks without explanation, returns briefly, then disappears again, they're not managing overwhelm. They're managing their exit strategy while keeping you available as a backup option. Watch for accompanying behavioral changes that indicate permanent withdrawal versus temporary overwhelm. Someone who's temporarily shut down might still show care through actions. They might still do thoughtful things for you, maintain household responsibilities, or show concern for your well-being even while being emotionally unavailable. Someone who's permanently checking out typically withdraws effort across all areas of the relationship. The 7-second test works when someone's silence comes from overwhelm, fear, or emotional flooding, states that can be regulated with time and space. It doesn't work when someone's silence comes from disinterest, resentment, or having already made the decision to end things. Using respectful space giving with someone who's already mentally gone just gives them more time to plan their exit while you wait patiently for a reconnection that will never come. Trust your own nervous system's response to their energy. Temporary shutdown from someone who cares about you usually generates anxiety in you because you can sense their internal struggle. And your attachment system recognizes that they're still emotionally invested but temporarily unavailable. Permanent withdrawal often generates a different feeling, a sense of emptiness, distance, or intuitive knowing that they're already gone even if they haven't officially left yet. Consider the overall trajectory of your relationship when deciding how to respond to their silence. If you've been building connection, working through issues together, and generally moving toward greater intimacy with occasional shutdowns during difficult moments, their silence likely represents temporary overwhelm that deserves patience. If you've been stuck in cycles of increasing distance, unresolved conflicts, and growing emotional unavailability, their silence might represent the final stage of their checkout process. Set internal boundaries around how long you're willing to give someone space without any communication or acknowledgement. Respecting someone's need for processing time is healthy. Accepting indefinite silence while they figure out whether they want to be with you is not. Decide ahead of time what time frame feels reasonable for your own emotional well-being and stick to it. The frequency of their shutdowns also matters. Someone who occasionally needs space during particularly challenging periods is different from someone who regularly uses silence as their primary response to any relationship difficulty. If silence is their default coping mechanism for any emotional challenge, you might be dealing with someone whose avoidance is too severe for a functional relationship rather than someone who just needs patience during temporary overwhelm. Watch for whether they take responsibility for their patterns and show genuine interest in improving their communication over time. Someone who acknowledges their tendency to shut down, apologizes for the impact on you, and makes efforts to give you context or warnings about their emotional state is different from someone who treats their silence as your problem to accept without complaint. The most important factor is whether their silence feels like a door that's temporarily closed or one that's been permanently locked. Trust your intuition about which type of silence you're dealing with, and don't sacrifice your own emotional well-being by giving endless patience to someone who's already decided you're not worth their effort to work through difficulties together. The long-term impact. How this changes your dynamic. When you consistently respond to an avoidant silence with respect rather than pursuit, you fundamentally rewire their expectations about what intimate relationships require and what kind of person you are in their internal categorization system. This seemingly simple change in your response pattern creates ripple effects that transform not just how they see you, but how they show up in the relationship and what they believe is possible between two people who care about each other. The dynamic gradually shifts from them managing your reactions to their emotional needs to both of you, collaborating to create a relationship structure that works for both people's nervous systems. They become more willing to give you context about their internal state, warn you when they're feeling overwhelmed, or negotiate timing for difficult conversations because they trust that you won't use their vulnerability against them. They begin to see you as fundamentally different from other people in their romantic history, someone who doesn't require them to abandon their self-protection strategies to maintain your interest. This distinction makes you feel safer to love, because they don't have to choose between loving you and protecting themselves. You become associated with expansion rather than constraint, growth rather than sacrifice. Perhaps most importantly, your respect for their process teaches them that they're worthy of love exactly as they are, not just as they could become if they overcame their avoidant patterns. This unconditional acceptance creates the psychological safety necessary for genuine growth and change, which ironically makes them more likely to develop greater emotional availability over time, not because you demanded it, but because they finally feel safe enough to risk it.